Obituaries are a great treat to read as long as they're not our own. Okay, apologies to Karl. They place lives in context, most often with reverence and appreciation. I love reading them because obits remind me that our seemingly ordinary and quotidian lives can be pretty remarkable too. It's the details that make people so fascinating. Mo's podcast, Mobituaries, introduces us, in his words, to people whose lives didn't get the send-off they deserve. I bring up Mobituaries not only because I love it so much, but because in his new book, Roctogenarians, Late in Life Debuts, Comebacks, and Triumphs, is every bit as much fun as is Mobituaries. Roctogenarians profiles people who have made it and keep making it well past the point of sitting around on a park bench. He suggests that, yes, there's massive truth to that line that we do get better as we age. And the best part is some of his profiles are still alive. One of my favorite sections of Roctogenarians is the things in the kitchen with no expiration date. That's really important in my house. I take that as a freewheeling and liberal permission to not worry about going through my cupboards or fridge anytime soon and possibly ever. Most profiles cover some people we've never heard of, but see their handiwork all the time in terms of innovation and invention, or artists who created masterworks almost by accident, or old wannabe Borscht Belt comedians who just kept innovating past 100 years old. The list goes on, and it's all so fun. The one to take us to some of Mo's highlights is Patt Morrison. Like Mo, Patt digs up the details that makes local history so thrilling and fun. Patt is someone who loves a whopping dose of history of LA, as recent as it is for the LA Times. She shared in 2 Pulitzers at the Times, has won an armload of Emmys, hosts a terrific podcast called Patt Morrison Asks, and is the author of several really good books. So here's what's going to happen tonight. Patt and Mo are going to chat for a while, and when they're done, you can ask questions, and I'll run around. Maybe somebody will help me with another mic, and when you ask a question, you got to use the mic because we're filming this. And Karl gets very upset when people just start asking with no sound. So afterwards, feel free to grab a couple of copies of Mo's books. Well, you got to buy them from Book Soup, but he signed them. It's such a good book, Roctogenarians. And Father's Day, I believe, was it already Father's Day? Okay, something's coming up.
There's always next year.
There's always next year. So anyway, thank you so much, and we'll see you soon. Enjoy it. Do I have a...
I think we're on.
And thanks to Andrea for putting this on. I mean, you know how long she's been doing this and how much work goes into it. So give her some love for that. And as far as standing up and waiting till we have the mic so we can hear you, you know, folks, and many, many political candidates have occasion to remember this ruefully, I have a hat pin and I am not afraid to use it. So keep that in mind. So Mo, we've enjoyed all your work for so long, and it's a pleasure to have you here in the flesh.
Thank you, Pat. I'm thrilled to be interviewed by you.
So as I was reading this book, I was thinking, I don't think this was your intention of making us feel like underachievers.
It's always my intention.
But then I realized your earlier book was about the dead. So I think we're moving in the right direction on this, right?
I've moved from the dead to the pre-dead, as I like to call them. So I'm edging ever so gradually towards the hot demographic for advertisers.
So, and we have some of that hot demographic here. Looking forward to your book about them, I'm sure.
Good.
But to read it is to remember, in a way, so many things that have changed about youth and age in our country and our culture over the last 100 years or so. And so to see some of these names, and I have a couple of friends who are in here, I mean, Karl Reiner and Norman Lear, and to see them as these achievers who have gone past, in a way, this Olympic barrier, and they're going for a second lap, in a way, a lot of these people. What was that idea behind the book, the sense that, Yeah, these folks are having another dip, having another bite at the apple, and they're showing that this still can be done.
I think so. I mean, the reason the subtitle is Debuts, Comebacks, and Triumphs is because, you know, all of these people have in common that they do not or did not accept the conventional wisdom, right? That the last third of your life should be a time for kind of winding down and clocking out and going gently into that good night. But there are, you know, different examples of it. Some people really did break through late in life, but then people like the comedians you mentioned and architects, which are really interesting, seem to keep getting better. I mean, you know, Frank Lloyd Wright and I.M. Pei, I mean, their capstones, if you will, of their careers were quite late in their lives. But I think that a lot of these people, part of what they're doing is they look at endings as beginnings. That comes up, there's a section of the book called Loss into Gain. So people like the painter Matisse, who in his 70s is unable to paint anymore because of cancer, but rather than playing a highlight reel of his greatest achievements as he lay dying, he traded his paintbrush for a pair of scissors, and then thus began this great period of paper cutouts, which was brilliant in its own way. So,
which may be what he's mostly known for by a lot of people now.
I think so. I mean, I'm lucky to live in New York and be able to go to MoMA, and they have the swimming pool, you know, reconstructed there. And I think you're right. I think it's probably the most memorable Matisse work that's at MoMA.
And for the people, well, let's situate it in the culture a little bit, because we were told that for millennia, older people were revered by the culture for their knowledge.
Yeah, mm-hmm.
Now you don't need a grandma, you need Google. That's kind of it.
I think that's right. I mean, look, this book is in part a response to, I mean, ageism is real, and right now, obviously, with the hellish presidential campaign already underway, we're hearing all about the downside of old age. We got it. We understand. And for the record, you know, I'm not a doctor. I don't even play one on TV. If you're old enough, you'll get that reference. But I mean, you know, I don't have much to say about the condition of the two candidates, but we're hearing over and over again about how dangerous it is to be older. And I understand that. I think a gerontocracy in politics is can be a dangerous thing. And it's not just in the White House, it's in the Senate and in Congress. But what's getting eclipsed, what's getting overshadowed is that there are great strengths that come with old age and experience. And ageism isn't just wrong, it's just really stupid. Because, I mean, like it or not, the population is aging, and there's all this amazing capital that's being sort of dismissed. That's
so it's wasteful.
I'm sorry?
It's wasteful.
It's wasteful. It's just wasteful. It's just dumb. And so I think my co-author John Greenberg and I wanted to show that not just now, but in the past, there are these people that did remarkable things in past the traditional age of retirement.
This is not a notion that has come to you recently, because you talk about how much you enjoyed the company of older people throughout your life. And
Yeah.
I feel the same way. I had both sets of my grandparents and one set of my great-grandparents. And to me, what they told me was always more interesting than what the people of my age were saying. And when I started as an intern at the paper and I found out that the man who created the Donald Duck character lived 10 miles from the office, I made a beeline,
Right.
you know, to Glendale. The man who in his 50s, who now was in his 90s, found out that penicillin cured TB. I made a beeline to interview him. And so how did your evolution story to come to these stories come about?
I think there were a few things. I had older parents, which I was always kind of happy about. I don't think I was ever embarrassed about that. So the kids I grew up with, their parents tended to be boomers, on the older end of the boomers. My parents were of what's called the silent generation. So my father, to him, Elvis Presley was sort of newfangled or kind of dangerous. He was a Bing Crosby guy. So I always kind of liked that. I think also maybe I was just sort of like, I was thinking today that we took a family trip from Maryland to California when I was 11 years old in 1980 on the now, long gone Western Airlines. And I remember, does anybody remember that? And I remember that I wanted so badly to please the flight attendants. And so I remember how unduly proud I was. I just thought of this today when I would say to the flight attendant after everything she asked, I'd say, yes, please, thank you. And she finally at one point just went, oh, your son is so polite. And so I think I loved just pleasing older people. So that's part of it. But then I think what happened was after my father died in 2004, I came up with this idea and I think it came from a place of wanting answers and wanting guidance. I created a show called My Grandmother's Ravioli on Cooking Channel, where I went around the country learning to cook from grandmothers and grandfathers in their kitchens. And what I learned hanging out with all these people is, and this is obviously a generality, is that the older people get, the less they care about what other people think of them, and that's really liberating. And you become unfettered. And you start making clearer, less cluttered choices. And so to me that's very aspirational because we all want to get there. And it seemed to me that a lot of the qualities we ascribe to younger people, the sort of go it alone, I'm going to do it my own way, was actually misapplied. It really applied more to older people, and that they were able to just act in a less complicated way. So I think all those things brought me to this place. And on CBS Sunday Morning, I just generally like interviewing older people more because they make me come to them. They're not coming to me. They haven't crowdsourced who they are. They're sort of like, this is who I am, like it or not. And even if they're selling a movie, the stakes aren't that high to them because I think they realize, who cares? Like Eva Marie Saint, I can't even remember, I loved her so much, and she's almost 100 now. She's the oldest living Oscar winner, I think. And I remember she made some movie, I can't even remember what it was, and in the middle of the interview she said, is the movie any good? And I said, it's really not. She just went, And then I have this weekend a piece with June Squibb, who's so amazing. And June Squibb is 94, and this is the first movie that she's ever headlined. And I'm telling you, this movie is a sheer and total delight. But she said to me too, she said, when I was younger, I was so hung up on pleasing other people. And now I just say, what the hell? And she kept saying, she said, it's not that she doesn't care about her craft. She says, who cares? And not surprisingly, she's happier and her work is better than it's ever been.
I think with women, there's an extra layer too. As you reach a point where you say, I don't care whether this guy's looking down the front of my shirt or not, right?
Yeah.
So, but there, I want to ask you about the cooking show too, and this may be a generational thing. Having gone through my grandmother's and great-grandmother's recipes, I think that they didn't write it all down. I think they wanted us to cook and say, yeah, but it doesn't taste like that. And they deliberately lied on those recipe cards.
Oh, that's interesting, to undercut future generations?
Yes.
That's interesting. See,
I love them both, but,
That's interesting. I love your dark take on this. I just assumed, no, because I was, none of these women measured. The guys, the grandfathers measured. They were much more mechanical about it. They were would look at the recipes and the books, but the women didn't. Even Peggy, the Irish grandmother, when she made scones, she didn't measure when she was baking. I mean, that's crazy. And I said, well, how can you ensure that the scones will turn out okay? And she said, God will take care of it. That was her answer. Yeah.
And presumably did.
They were like half the time.
Okay. Well, he has other things on his mind too. Yeah. So. There was a book some years ago by an Australian Nobel Prize winner called How to Win a Nobel Prize. And I think the first rule was stay alive because you can't get a posthumous Nobel Prize.
Right.
So all of the people in your book had that in common. But what other threads did you find in common? Because their pursuits and their interests are so disparate.
Well, it's funny you mentioned the Nobel Prize because there's a section which is a little bit of an outlier in the book called It's About Time. And it includes one great Angelino, Tyrus Wong, who lived until 106. And he was really, really responsible for the look of Bambi. He was a desperately poor Chinese immigrant who came with his father when he was 9 years old, and the father worked hard to enroll him in Pasadena's Otis Art Institute. And when he came to Disney, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs had already been released. It was the first big feature blockbuster, I guess, and it was really noted for its great detail. And what he did for the backgrounds of Bambi is he used his background and his experience studying both the French Impressionists, but also the landscapes of the Song dynasty to really emphasize brushwork and mood over detail. And it created this kind of lush, very environmental look, and which Walt Disney himself, who never even met Tyrus Wong, said, "This is the look, this is it." He never got much credit for it at all. He's in the end credits, and at 90, he was named a Disney legend. And we wanted to include people like him and like Nobel laureate John Goodenough, who was the co-inventor of the lithium-ion battery, who I believe is the oldest Nobel recipient ever at 97, and Carmen Herrera, an abstract expressionist painter who had her very first solo exhibition at a major museum when she was 101. We wanted to include these three because they were sort of the anti-Van Gogh. They're people who had accomplished great things, but thank God had lived long enough to get their recognition. So it's not necessarily that they were doing their greatest work at the end. And what all three of them had in common is they all had really, really long marriages. And they had, Tyrus Wong was married for 58 years, John Goodenough and Carmen Herrera for over 60 years, and they all credited their spouses with seeing them through the really hard times when no one was giving them credit. I mean, Carmen Herrera, she sold maybe a couple of paintings early in life, and then there were just decades where she didn't even sell paintings, and then was discovered at 101, and thank God was still painting. So that's something those three had in common.
The list is very diverse, and you break them down into chapters, and some of the subheads I really thought were very funny for a few individuals. Let's see if I can find, oh yes, Old Money, Old Country, Old Spice, Sophia Loren, Old Ironsides, Jack LaLanne, Old English, Judi Dench, Old News, Mike Wallace. Those made me laugh. But how did you, from presumably a much larger field, winnow down to these people, choose these fields, and were there people who said no to you?
Well, so I'm so glad you pointed out what are sort of one-page interstitials, these kind of, Old Country is Willie Nelson, I feel like I've learned from the best. At CBS Sunday Morning, it's so much about the show is about the mix, and I'm very, very focused on mix, meaning that I almost look at it as like protein and carbs, that you want stories that feel very fortifying, that might be quite serious, that feel nutritious, and other stuff that's just like candy, fun little things. So Old Cheese, like Vito Storico, which is 18 years old generally, that's fun. Or under the personal milestone section, Mr. Pickles, the Houston Zoo tortoise who became a first-time father at 90. I mean, Al Pacino was just a kid at 83.
Is that one Old Sperm?
Exactly. Yeah. And he'll live until 150 probably. So there's more to come. Oh, sorry, that was unintentional. I'm not even going to take credit for that. So because that really just came out. Okay, stop. So I think it's about. I want everything. I was about to say to go down easy, so I've got to stop. But I want it to go down easy. I want things to feel like a surprise and a delight. So you have Mary Church Terrell, I think a very inspiring story about a civil rights leader, followed by something that's fun and light. And so a lot of it was just about, with quite literally index cards, putting out these ideas. And there are some cheats in there. I really liked the idea of a one page just called Old Yeller, and there was no one that could go there other than Ethel Merman. And the truth is that Ethel Merman, it was amazing that she gave a concert at Carnegie Hall at age 70 and still had this great brassy instrument. There are other singers that could have gone there, but they wouldn't have fit the label of Old Yeller. So some of this is
Yeah. Well, and didn't you have Mel Brooks in here saying something about going to see her in a show?
Yes. Yeah, that's right. When he was a kid going to Broadway and just being bowled over. Yeah.
So Mel Brooks, even as a kid, thought she was too loud.
Exactly. Yeah.
Why have we veered away from, we don't like the word died anymore. We like passed away. Why have we flinched at the word old and come up with euphemisms?
Well, that's so interesting what you say. And one of my brothers, I remember, I don't think he was scolding me, but somebody kept using the euphemism "passed away," and he said, "What is this? What are we, new
I just
agey?
tweeted
Is
about
this a
that
spirit
today.
passing away? You die." And so I think that's a good question. I think some of this probably is about us distancing ourselves from the really old, and so maybe it's just a distancing thing. But I think that there are a lot of people, though, who would rather face these truths. And I thought about these when with widows. This is sort of related, I guess, which is I have met in my time older women who love their husbands and who will be very, very sad when their husbands die, but also will admit that they kind of like their husbands to get on with the show, if you know what I mean. And and just because they know that after their husbands die, like, they're going to be kind of liberated. And so they'll be sad. Both things can be true at once. I mean, my grandmother was that way. I mean, the best decade of her life was when she was widowed at 77, from then until 87. She worked in a department store. She'd have the girls, as she called them, from the department store come over to her apartment and drink wine, and she had a great time. So I think there are dark truths that we probably avoid a lot.
Yeah, my mother would finally drink a cocktail after my father died and went to her first R-rated movie after my father died.
Wait, say that again?
Her first R-rated movie after my father died.
Wow, what was it?
I don't remember. It wasn't Midnight Cowboy. I'll have to find out. But so let's talk about some of your favorites, because some of these people are so admirable, and some of these people, it seemed like there was also a lightning strike later in life.
Yeah.
This wasn't something they had built to, but it was something that just came upon them. And maybe with that in mind, you can talk about some of these people. And some of them surprised me. Like Estelle Getty was so young when she got a role to act 20 years older in Golden Girls.
Right. Estelle Getty's sort of her situation, there are, I guess, a couple of different ironies, right? Because she's, as you point out, she played the mother on by the way, you write a book like this, by law, you have to include one Golden Girl at least. I feel like the book would have been banned if it had no Golden Girls. So Sophia was the one to do Estelle Getty. And it's true, to get the role, she put on a powdered wig and aged herself up, and because she was 61, I guess, when she auditioned for it, and 62 when she debuted in the role. But she was also the only one who was unknown. And she had led, it's not that she came to acting late. From the age of 4, growing up in the Lower East Side, her father would take the family to the Academy of Music to watch vaudeville acts and to see early movies. She got married. She went and she waited tables in the Catskills trying stand-up comedy. She married at 23. She had 2 sons. She raised her family. And all that time, she just took any bit part she could off Broadway. And when her kids finally went off to college, she dedicated herself fully to this pursuit. She never gave it up. But one of the things I loved about her, and it's something I actually learned from Linda Lavin, another interviewee on Sunday Morning that I really enjoyed, was Linda Lavin said, you gotta let them know you're alive. It doesn't matter who you are. You gotta let them know you're out there, whatever it takes. And Estelle Getty went to see a play off Broadway by a then unknown Harvey Fierstein. It was the short play that would comprise one of the 3 of Torch Song Trilogy. And she went backstage afterwards, she introduced herself, and she said, write me a role. And I think he was so taken aback and charmed, more taken aback, but he ended up doing it. And she ended up becoming the mother in what was the 3rd act of Torch Song Trilogy. And that put her on the map. And at 62, she was cast in The Golden Girls and made her network television debut and became one of the funniest characters of the last 40 years. And, you know, it just seems like that life that she led, it just seems so right that she should have that at that point in her life.
Do you think that when people look at folks like these that you write about in your book, they think they're outliers, or do they think, you know, hey, maybe you've heard from your audiences, maybe I'm neglecting myself, maybe I have some of this in me as well?
You mean readers or the people that
Readers, yes.
Well, I hope they do, because especially when you read about the writers that are in the book, you'll see how filled with doubt they themselves were. I mean, it's hard to believe that Frank McCourt it took decades for people, including his high school English students, to convince him that he had a story worth telling. He didn't think his own story was worth telling. He was also ashamed of his poverty growing up in Limerick, Ireland. And he finally decided, in his own words, that he would die howling if he didn't get this story out of him. And I find that it gives me chills to read those words, and that on the other side of that, had he not done that, the heartbreak of not telling his story, but he was so racked with doubt. So he writes it, it's published, Angela's Ashes, when he's 66, is a global sensation. And then he later said, it took me 2 years in all of my life to write this. And in writing this book, my own mother, an immigrant from Colombia, who is a very private person, came to me and she said, are you going to write about me? And at first I thought she was kidding. And then she asked again a few weeks later, are you going to write about me? And then I went, oh my God, she wants me to do this. And I did that thing that we know we're supposed to do, for some reason many of us don't, which is I finally sat down with her and I interviewed her. I asked her all these questions, and I filled in a lot of gaps. But ultimately, I was just so grateful that she let me do this, but also so relieved that she accepted that her story is worth telling. So I guess to answer your question, I think that people will look for themselves in these stories, and I hope they find themselves in these stories, because these people did extraordinary things, but they weren't genetically they're chromosomally any different than any of us. I mean, Colonel Sanders was a guy whose business collapsed because a highway bypassed his little eatery. And at 66, he only had $105 a month on Social Security. He had to do something. And so he didn't look backwards, which is what all these people have in common. They're in it. They're not taking victory laps. They're in it. And he just went and he got in a car with 2 pressure cookers and a bucket of seasoning and went town to town cooking chicken for people. And within 8 years, he was the face of an empire with 800 outlets worldwide.
But I think you're right about people needing to know that their stories are worthwhile, because I did what you did at 12 or 13. I sat down with a cassette recorder with great aunts and uncles and people like that. And the stories that they told of, you know, I had one great aunt who, our farm in the Midwest had some really nice walnut trees. And during World War I, they came and cut down trees and bought them for propellers for these newfangled airplanes they were using in combat now. So people need other people to tell them that their stories are worth listening to, too.
I think that's absolutely right. I mean, I think it's, you know, I learned, it took me, my first job in television, which I loved, writing for the TV series Wishbone out in a suburb of Dallas. The suburb was so antiseptic that I felt that hunger to do what you were actually doing at 12 and 13. And so now everywhere I go, I make sure to look at historic markers and read them. It's just instinctual, just so that I feel like there's ground beneath my feet and that it's rooted in some way. I mean, being here, I didn't know about this place. I didn't know that Judy Garland and her sisters, before she was famous, they performed here. This is, I guess some people say, where they were discovered. But I mean, even before, you know, we came on stage tonight, I wanted to be brought all around here. And I think that's that same instinct that drove you to talk to your aunts and uncles lives in me.
But I think it's also a characteristic of people in this book. They're always interested. You said they weren't looking backwards. They were always looking forward and looking around themselves, too.
Yeah, looking around them. Yeah, and I think also, and I think perhaps this is a quality that most people have as they get older, they weren't fretful. They weren't, even though they're of an age when there's less time on the other side, they weren't fixated on that. They were very present-minded.
There were some other people who were among your favorites here. One of my favorites, Madame Clicquot. Yeah, I mean, who would not like Madame Clicquot, right?
Well, yeah, Madame Clicquot, she is one of the youngest people in the book. In 19th century France, if you were a widow, you had more rights than if you were a married woman. So at the age of 21, she was married. She was widowed, I believe, at the age of 27.
She did not bump off her husband, however, even though the laws would make it very tempting to do so.
She did not kill her husband. Although there was another widow in the book, Mary Delaney, I think, who was very happy to be widowed. But Madame Clicquot was widowed at 27, and she took the failing wine business that her husband had been running, and she completely revitalized it. And she had such foresight that as the Napoleonic Wars were ending between France and Russia, she knew to get this product that she knew the Russians liked, champagne, which she helped innovate as well and make much better. She knew to smuggle it around a naval blockade through Königsberg to get to St. Petersburg, and they got hooked on what was eventually called Veuve Clicquot, and my French is terrible, but which literally means the widow Clicquot. Veuve is widow, right?
It is.
And
so they would just order, they wouldn't even say Clicquot after a while, they'd just say La Veuve, I want to order the widow.
the widow, right?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, but that was a story. Even though she was quite young when she was widowed and did that, it was a great story of somebody kind of breaking free and really striking forward.
And there are a couple others that are particularly enchanting for me. Diana Nyad's story, if you saw the movie with Annette Bening and Jodie Foster, and Brian May of Queen, who nobody believes is an astrophysicist, but he really is. Like,
Yeah.
yes, it really is rocket science.
It's real, this. So many of these stories, and Matisse and other people the same way, and Frank McCourt and Laura Ingalls Wilder in more obvious ways, are sort of returning to childhood. So Diana Nyad and Brian May are both in a section of the book called Unfinished Business. Brian May was studying astrophysics when he decided, well, you know what? This sideline I have could really work out, and he became a Hall of Fame guitarist for Queen, but it lingered, this passion for astrophysics, so he ended up going back to school and earning his PhD at the age of 60. And Diana Nyad is an outlier in the book because her achievement was physical, right? Physical diminishment is an inevitability, but Diana Nyad fantastically sort of bucked that, and she had tried to swim from Cuba to Florida when she was 28, and it didn't work out. And she really set that dream aside for 30 years. And if you've seen the movie, which I think that performance was crazy extraordinary.
Should have been the Oscar.
It's one of those performances. My partner and I, we were eating dinner at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York a couple weeks ago, and she was at the next table. And it was all I could do not to go over and just say, I bet I didn't want to do it because I was getting the vibe, like, don't do it. But that performance is just so nutty, amazing, what she does there. And part of what I love about it is that Annette Bening wasn't afraid to make Diana Nyad less than likable at times. Because what's clear is that Diana Nyad is so driven that even her best friends at times want to strangle her. And she herself admits that. But in any case, when Diana Nyad tried again at 58, and tried again, and tried again, and tried again, and succeeded at 64. So, I mean, that's when you go, stick-to-itiveness really needs to be a word in the dictionary.
You've got a few other favorites, and you mentioned architects earlier in I Am Pei. What is it about architects that makes later life more productive or maybe more opportunities for creativity?
You know, I think that there are at least a couple of reasons that seem very practical, which are that if you're commissioning an architect to do a very expensive project, you're unlikely to go to somebody young with not a lot of experience. That's one thing. I think also the reason, and it's really remarkable how many architects really do peak very late in life, as in their 90s, that they've gotten to a place where they have a staff that allows them to not have to do the grunt work, right? But I think in the case of I.M. Pei and with Frank Lloyd Wright, two of the three architects in the book, they were also drawing, of course, on past experience. One of the reasons I love the story of I.M. Pei is that he was in his 70s when French President Mitterrand asked him to take the Louvre, an 800-year-old palace, which many people may not remember was kind of a dump of a museum. On average, visitors stayed for less than an hour. It was poorly organized, terribly ventilated. It was confusing, and they needed to rejuvenate the whole thing. And he hired this Chinese-American architect. And when I.M. Pei unveiled the design for a pyramid to go in the courtyard, the French were horrified by this, that he would do this. And eventually, Mitterrand really backed him, and they prevailed. And I love that a glass pyramid, what could be more rock and roll than taking an 800-year-old palace and putting a glass pyramid right in the middle of it? That is such a ballsy move. And I think it's so appropriate that I.M. Pei went on to then design the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame.
And that people now love the pyramid.
It rivals the Eiffel Tower as, I think, an emblem of Paris.
And certainly the selfie center.
Was it?
As a selfie center, too.
As a selfie center, exactly, yeah.
And that goes back to your sense of being liberated. At some point, what do you have to risk if somebody's asking you to go for broke on something like that?
Exactly. Who cares, right? Because you realize what's going to happen. I mean, I remember I profiled Albert Brooks for CBS Sunday Morning, and in my research, I had looked at performances that he had done early in his career. This was when he was quite young, on very mainstream variety shows on network television. And a lot of the time, the audience just wasn't getting it because what he was doing was so new. And I marveled at it. And I thought, to have the guts to not speed up, to not dump out of an act, to just keep going when no one's laughing. And I asked Albert Brooks, I said, at that moment, I mean, weren't you panicking? And he said, no. And I said, what were you thinking? And he said, I just thought, if this comedy thing doesn't work out, I'll go sell shoes. And I just thought, that is so strong and so great. But yeah. And one other thing about I.M. Pei, though, that I think is interesting, though, is, and I think this has to do with experience, the pyramid was going to go on the top of the JFK Library in Boston. And for zoning reasons, because the location of the library changed, he was heartbroken when they couldn't make it work. But he kept that, he socked that away, that idea and that design, and then brought it back. And I kind of love that too.
When Frank Gehry was first approached about the Disney Concert Hall, this being Los Angeles, of course, the first thing all the money went into was the parking garage underground, which gave him time to do the museum in Bilbao. And he told me at one point that it made him think more and better about how to do the Disney Hall because he had that period of time, the distance to reflect to,
right.
And the notion that, well, it may just end up being a parking garage, so what the hell?
Right.
But that idea of bringing it back around through different filters and analyses, or selling shoes as a prospect, is something that comes through too.
Yeah, but that's so, and Frank Lloyd Wright did that with the Guggenheim. It was originally, the spiral was for a car park in the mountains of Maryland, and the cars were going to drive around up it, and it didn't work out.
Here's your next book, Garages and Architecture, I think.
It was that?
Garages and Architecture.
Yeah, exactly, yes. God, that would have been great if Disney, if Frank Lloyd Wright had done the parking lot for the Disney Concert Hall.
But he was inspired by Frank Lloyd Wright at the Guggenheim by this.
He salvaged that design that had never been built, that had never been implemented, and made that the basis of the Guggenheim.
There's one part of the book where you talk about people who come late to new romances.
Yeah.
And oftentimes with older people, this is kind of risible rather than substantive. And, you know, George Burns made a second career out of joking about his, you know, his dating career. But you talk about Carol Channing, and I remember interviewing her years ago after she had just married this guy who was
Right.
the new old love of her life. And she was talking like she was 16 years old. I think she always talked like she was 16 years old, so maybe there was no difference there. But talk about that aspect of how you approach that in your book and why you thought it was important to put that in too.
Well, first of all, I'm jealous that you got to interview Carol Channing because apparently she was a great interview, and I wish I had interviewed her. You know, we thought it was important to include personal milestones like late in life parenthood, late in life coming out, and late in life romance. And Carol Channing, I mean, she was the avatar of stamina. I mean, she had played Dolly Levi thousands of times. And I believe it was her third marriage, had been about 40 years long. She filed for divorce. She went to the press to complain about the marriage, said that they had only had relations twice in 40 years. And apparently the matinee and evening performances had both been panned by the critics. And she, rim shot, okay. And then the husband died before the divorce was finalized. And then she wrote in her memoir about a long lost love, her junior high school sweetheart, Harry Colligian, whom she'd grown up with in San Francisco. And then a mutual friend of Carol's and Harry's went to Harry and said, "Hey, you should reach out to Carol." And Harry said, "Carol? I thought she was dead." And he said, "No, she's written this book." And so he got in touch with her. And apparently the last 2 years of their lives, as you can attest, were giggly and just and wonderful. So, I mean, it's a fantasy, but it's real. I think a lot of people do probably think about the one who got away.
And that, unlike the kinds of achievements you wrote about, can carry some stigma, like, oh, that old goat or that old bag, and, you know, taking off at this point.
I think so, and I think that's, of course, really silly, and it shouldn't. Yeah.
Did any of the people talk to you about the downsides of being who and what age they were, apart from physical limitations?
Yeah, Rita Moreno, who I'd interviewed 11 years ago on CBS, and who I really thought when I interviewed her, it was for her memoir. I thought that was going to be her valedictory, that she was basically saying, "So long, folks, I'm going to retire and hopefully live peacefully." I had no idea that her late 80s and 90s were going to involve 4 seasons of a sitcom, movies. I mean, she's really something else. But she did tell me that when she left her home in Oakland and moved into a very nice senior living facility, she said that she plunged into a depression. But she self-examined, and she came to the conclusion that the reason she was so sad was that she didn't know how to make friends. And when she was telling me about this, I found this so compelling. And she said, "I had friends from long ago, but I didn't know how to make friends. And here I was in this new environment without anyone." And so there was a grocery store she would go to where she would often see this woman who smiled at her. And so she went back to the grocery store, and she saw the woman again, and she just went up to her and she said, "Would you like to have lunch sometime?" And the woman was startled, and then said, "Okay." And then they went to lunch the next day, and the woman said to her, as soon as they sat down, "I'm sorry, but can I ask you, do you always go around grocery stores picking up women?" And so, and Rita understood that, look, she's Rita Moreno. She's going to have more opportunity. People are going to look at her and be more open to her. But I don't think it's a coincidence that she is so vital. And when you talk to her on the phone, which is something I'd never experienced before, because I've interviewed plenty of octogenarians and nonagenarians where I sit across and I go, "God, this person looks great and is just really on top of things." But talking to her on the phone is a wild experience because her cadence and the way she can handle just just the rhythm of the conversation, it's like you're talking to a 30-year-old. It's really wild. Like there's no, even with my mother, who is in great shape, and she'd kill me if I told people how old she is, but she's 4 years shy of a very big birthday that involves 3 digits. But but when I talked to her on the phone, you know, I had to really pace myself. But Rita is so completely engaged. She herself chalks it up in large part to luck and to genetics, but it's also to this constant proactive engagement with other people.
And it takes effort to do that.
It takes effort, and she was, you know, and she doesn't sugarcoat it. It's very difficult for her to even talk about giving up her driver's license or, you know, giving up driving.
She's in New York and she drives?
No. Rita Moreno lives in the Bay Area.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because, you know, when New Yorkers say they can drive, it means they can make right turns at 5 miles an hour looking for a parking space. They can't really drive.
Right.
Now, there's a chapter which was, I have to say, was one of my favorites because it involved, and I will read you this description, quote, the most unpopular public man that ever held any office in the United States, and it's not who you think it is. This chapter is called Misspent Old Age, and the characters in it are Ezra Pound, Phil Spector, Rudy Giuliani, and the man of whom I just described, John Tyler, a president of the United States.
President John Tyler.
So I love the name of that chapter, Misspent Old Age. So not everybody can go forward or even stand still. Some people go backwards.
I mean, some people, you just want to say, just do nothing. Just don't do anything. And because your reputation's really great, and just don't do anything. And John Tyler, our 10th president, was the first to succeed on the death of a president when William Henry Harrison forgot to wear a hat on Inauguration Day and gave a 2.5-hour speech and then died 31 days later. But he sort of, John Tyler, it was a big deal, established the idea of presidential succession. He had a lot of underminers, but persevered. But then he sided with the Confederacy and actually was elected to the Confederate Congress, but died before he could take office. And the New York Times, I mean, you're reading from that, pilloried him at the end and called him a disgrace. And, you know, look, Rudy Giuliani, I mean, his mayoralty was not without controversy, but there were definitely things that I think even his harshest detractors would acknowledge that he did right as mayor. I think one of the things he showed was that New York City could actually be governed. I think there was some doubt with how bad crime was in the late 80s before he took office. You know, and then the way he handled the aftermath of 9/11 in New York and became Times Man of the Year, but then of course his behavior since then and with the election of 2020. And there is a reason I don't believe he's been disbarred yet, and I'm not sure he has declared bankruptcy yet, but those things seem inevitable.
Yeah. And then there was the Borat film.
Well, right, exactly, yes. I mean, come on.
He wrote it, I didn't bring it up out of the blues.
Yeah.
And then, you know, Phil Spector, whose decline, of course, we've read about, it's been chronicled for here, and died in prison, the man who created the Wall of Sound.
Yeah, you know, and I looked for the only good thing about writing about Phil Spector is it's an opportunity to write about Tina Turner and River Deep Mountain High, which first, I just keep asking Alexa to play that song. I just love the performance. And
I think Alexa's going to quit if you keep this up.
Right, Alexa. No, I know. I've got to be nicer to Alexa. But and you know, and he himself traced his mental deterioration from that point. I'm not sure how believable that is. That single, which kind of was the exemplar, right, of the Wall of Sound, was actually a flop in the U.S. It was a hit on the UK charts, but he has speculated that his descent into madness began with that disappointment. I'm not sure I believe that, but of course he ended up murdering a woman. So.
Well, Phil Spector blamed rock and roll. That's a new one.
Yeah, right. I don't think it held up at trial.
We're about to get to your questions, but is there anything I've missed that you want to be sure you get to?
No, I just, what can I say? Old people are my jam. No.
And the next book is, going into 50-year-olds, or where is this leading you?
You know, I think like I had this idea, but I don't know that it's really commercial. I keep thinking about a book called Things I Wish Were True. And the reason is I remember going to Hodgenville, Kentucky.
I think that's Project 2025.
It might be. Okay.
Okay.
I went to Hodgenville, Kentucky, to the birthplace of Abraham Lincoln, because I love going to different historic sites. And they had there the log cabin that Abraham Lincoln was born in. And then when you go up there, there's a little disclaimer. And I think it's even stronger now because they've proven that he was not actually born there. But at the time, they had a disclaimer sort of saying, we believe that only some of these logs in this log cabin were part of the log cabin he was born in. And you just go, oh, really? Why did you have to tell me that? And I came home and I told my father that. He said, wow, you saw where Lincoln was born? And I said, well, actually, it's not really the log cabin. They think that some of the logs were in. And my father said the same thing, because don't tell me that. Like, so there's just certain things you just want to be true. Yeah, like I found out, I was talking to a Boston affiliate today, and they asked me about Leominster, Massachusetts, a factory town that my father grew up in. And I said, oh, my father would tell me all these stories. And Johnny Appleseed was from there. The sewing machine was invented there. But he told me the disco ball was invented there. And Google does not agree with that. And then then actually the anchor I was talking to from the Boston station, she said, well, let's just believe it's true.
Johnny Appleseed did plant apple trees on our farm, and we do have the proof. So if you ever want to make your way to Ohio, we'll see what we can do.
Where in Ohio?
Near Columbus. It was
What
on the way to the cider presses. I'll tell you more later.
Okay. Well, I'm a fan of Ohio has really great historical markers. They have a really great state historical association. And even though, and they call themselves the mother of presidents, even though only 7 presidents are from there and 8 are from Virginia. Virginia has 8.
Well,
yeah. But
well,
let's just believe that Ohio is the mother of presidents.
See? You're already off to a good start on that.
Yes.
So, all right, so let's get your questions, and we do want you to stand up, and we can get the microphone to you so we can get that recorded and everybody can hear what it is you've got to say. Let's hold on to the mic ourselves so we can keep the volume control. So I know you want to grab it. Please do not.
That's fine.
That's what the hat pin is for. Sorry, don't mean to threaten violence.
Hi, thank you. I agree with both of you that the grandmothers left out some ingredients, but I'm not sure they did it on purpose. They just did everything by feel, so they didn't have recipes. What I wanted to ask was, is there an audiobook?
Thank you for asking. There is an audiobook, and it's read by me. And so yeah, and it was fun to read. Yeah. I'm trying to think if I had to do any accents in it, because that would have made me nervous, because I'm not great with that. There are a lot of proper names, so I had a good audiobook producer who helped me with that. Yes, there is an audiobook. Thank you for asking.
Okay, next question, and we will hold on to the mic. So there's one over here.
Hi. In the book, you say, if not 1969, you would like to have been born in 1888. Why?
Okay, so yeah, so look, I'm happy that I was born in 1969, but my second choice would have been 1888. And the reason is I've gamed this out completely, because I think it would be wonderful to be 12 years old when at the end of the century, right? Because it was a very big deal in 1900. Fin de siècle? How do you pronounce it?
Fin de siècle.
Yeah. And then I would have been 16 for the World's Fair in St. Louis.
But you could have been drafted in World War I.
No, I've timed this. I've worked this out because
Well,
I don't.
12 and
I'm
17.
too old.
Oh, you're
No.
29. You're
I'm
too
too old. That's the whole point. I don't want to go to World War I. I'm not made for trench warfare. It's not my thing.
Or trench mouth, I presume.
Right? No, absolutely not. And so I'm too old to get drafted for World War I. But then I joined the Orpheum circuit, right, for the 5 a day
Big
in vaudeville, right? And maybe I opened for the Nicholas Brothers. I don't know. And then what happens is then I move on to Broadway, and then by my late age, I'm able in early television to get a good sort of second banana character role. Like maybe I'm friends with William Frawley, so like, you know, something like that. And then I plots in the 1960s, right before everything starts going downhill.
88, good year. Who was president then?
1888 is
It wasn't
an
Garfield.
election. It's an election year, so
Right.
it's when Grover Cleveland runs for his second term. Because remember, Benjamin Harrison is the meat in the Grover Cleveland
Right.
sandwich.
In, out, in.
Exactly,
Yeah.
and you're going to be hearing a lot about Grover Cleveland in the next few
Yeah,
months
we know
because of the
why.
non-consecutive terms.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, somebody else. Okay, here.
Hi there. With a book like this, how do you know when you're done?
That's the editor's job, is to yank it out of your hands, right?
So it's a great question. I will tell you that this was written under a fairly tight deadline because when I talked to the publisher at Simon & Schuster about it, they wanted it to come out before the election because they speculated that age would be a very hot topic, and they wanted it before the summer because the summer, lucky you, is going to be all political books, and so it's going to be saturated with political books. And I liked the size and the weight of the Mobituaries book, so that ended up being 384 pages, ended up being a good guideline for it. But as I said, it was very important to come up with one-page little interstitials because I think people need little snacks. I think they want fun, shorter things in between the longer things. So once we were done with the longer essays, it was really a feel thing. I think we probably looked at the word count. I think we were about at 75,000 words at that point, and then at that point I said, okay, let's now do short things in between.
Everybody
Yeah.
wants to take something home to share, like, you know, old turtle sperm. That's going to be a big one tonight,
Right.
I think, when you all get
I
home.
hope so. If that's your takeaway, your parting gift is turtle sperm.
Another question? Here we are.
I have a friend named Mo, who's 81 and still a blues musician, an American who lives in Paris. So if you want information about my friend Mo, I have that here.
Wow.
Wha-
A blues musician living in Paris.
Right, American.
Wow.
He got his
That's-
he got a master's in philosophy at Cal State Northridge, but it's a good story.
Well, I'm hoping for a sequel. I mean, believe me, there are people that we could not fit into the book, including my friend Marilyn May, who at 96, last year at 95 sold out Carnegie Hall. And I mean, she's a marvel, but there are people that can already fill a sequel.
Another question?
Thank you.
There's one.
What is your work week like?
My work week, my day job, as it were, is with CBS Sunday Morning, and it's very flexible, which I'm very grateful for. And for this book and the last book I did, I took sort of an unofficial sabbatical. So I worked at the same time that I was doing pieces, and then I kind of disappeared for a few months when the rubber really hit the road. But that's basically my work week. More of it is at home, like a lot of people. But I need a balance. I've always needed a balance between more solitary work and collaborative work. Because if all I did were TV pieces, which are very collaborative, I think I would be hungering for something else, and I could not live the life of a novelist, of somebody who was always solitary. And even in this book, it was collaborative. But it's a balance. You know, a friend of mine, a playwright and screenwriter named John Tollins, told me early on, gave me advice, and he said, you always have to have something that belongs to you. And because he was working as a screenwriter in Hollywood, and I think that could be maddening. Writing things that don't get produced, writing things that get rewritten by teams of other people, or being handed something that somebody else wrote to rewrite only to be rewritten. And it can be soul crushing. And so he wrote plays on the side. And his best work, I think, was a play called Buyer and Seller, which was produced off Broadway and was hilarious. But he said, you have to have something that belongs to you. And while I love what I do on TV, something like this is much more in my control and sort of belongs to me. And my podcast also, because you can really go deep on it. Yeah.
And somebody else? We're getting near the end. Let's go over here, and then we'll finish up with this woman in the front row.
Love the books. You know, Kenny Rogers said you got to know when to hold them and when to fold them. You know, there's a whole generation that does not think Bob Hope was funny because all they saw was this old man reading cue cards. You know, and Frank Sinatra would sing and forget lyrics. Should certain performers know when to fold them?
That's interesting. The people who know, you know, the people that I respect the most, I suppose, are, I mean, Sinatra's in a class by himself. You know, Willie Nelson's in this book, and it's so funny that Willie Nelson's favorite singer is Frank Sinatra, which would surprise a lot of people. Frank Sinatra's also in the book for also criticizing the national anthem, thinking it's a lousy song, but when the one time he sang it at a ball game, he went up on the lyrics, so that might be why he doesn't like it. But the people I admire most are the people, the artists who keep changing. You know, I think there's, I love nostalgia, but concert performers who spend 30 years just doing the same hits over and over again, I don't know. I don't want to sound patronizing. I mean, their fans love them, but I'm not inspired. But I did a Mobituary on Peggy Lee, and Peggy Lee, just her entire life was a quest, an artistic and spiritual quest. I mean, she had very little formal education, but she just kept learning and kept trying different things and kept writing. I mean, she was a pioneering songwriter as a woman when a lot of women didn't have songs, certainly that they sang, published. So I suppose the people who keep trying new things should never stop. They should not fold them. Yeah, I don't know if that answers your question. Yeah. And I get why some people also want to be remembered, certainly performers, for who they were in an earlier life. But it would be interesting to see some great actors, men and women, age naturally and see what that does to their work.
Didn't Peggy Lee sing Is That All There Is?
Say that again?
Didn't Peggy Lee sing Is That All There Is?
Oh, yeah. Peggy, Lieber and Stoller wrote it, so she didn't write it, and I think they had offered it to Streisand first. But and as much as I love Streisand, I'm so glad that Peggy Lee got the song, because it's
Wrong voice.
It's just perfect. Although her granddaughter told me that she never looked at it as an anthem of ennui, that Is That All There Is was really kind of an optimistic song for her.
Going right to what you were talking about in your book.
Right.
So Can we get the last question here, please?
Hi, thank you. I always talked to my grandmother, and she told me about interesting people or that might have been in her background, such as she always told me there was Jewish pirates, which I was fascinated by, but I'm wondering, did you have any interesting ancestors?
Oh, do I have interesting ancestors? God, I wish I were high profile enough that Henry Louis Gates would have me on that show. I mean, really, because I would love to know where I come from. I know on my mother's side that there were people in politics in Colombia long ago, and on my father's side there were Italian immigrants, but I know very little. And I'm sorry about that. I regret that. I know very much about my father's boyhood growing up, and now more about my mother growing up in Colombia. One of the things I did learn, that it's interesting how these things shape you. When my mother was an infant, her father had this idea of the American dream and brought the family by boat from Colombia to New York City. And his timing couldn't have been worse. It was the fall of 1928. And so a year later, after the stock market crash, and a couple of years after that, they had to go back in what was really kind of a humiliating reverse commute. And it's funny because Frank McCourt had the same thing, and also very hungry caterpillar, Eric, what's his last name? Eric Karl, who I interviewed, had the same thing, although theirs was really ghoulish. In the 1930s in upstate New York, an aunt came from Germany and said, everything's fine, come back. I mean, talk about what a mistake. But my mother's father was so humiliated, came back to Columbia with his tail between his legs and remained a dour and gloomy person for the rest of his life. And my mother had never talked about him, never. And because I always wondered, he had died so long ago. And part of my mother telling me her own story was her as a young woman, and I knew this just factually, coming to the United States on her own much later in the 1950s and succeeding. And I said, and only in telling her story did she realize that she managed to do what her father unfortunately was unable to do, and she was able to be proud of that. So only by telling her story could she get to that place. Yeah.
So please thank Mo Rocca.
Yeah. Thank you.
And Patt Morrison.
Yes. Thank you, Patt Morrison. I'm so privileged to be interviewed by you. Thank you very much.